Welcome to This Week in Heresy, Episode 4, Bible Translation, Citation Needed, with our in-studio guest, Philip Tanner, also known as the Greek Geek. So, Philip, welcome to This Week in Heresy.
Well, thank you for having me, Gina. It's great to see this project get off the ground.
Well, it's nice to do it again, and you were pretty instrumental in a lot of the fame of the other one.
That just trips me out.
Yeah, well, if people don't know, if you haven't seen the video version that we did in 2012, Philip is the Greek Geek. He did the Greek Geek segments about Bible translation and Bible words and Hebrew and Greek and
specifically the 7 particular places in the New Testament that are used from the Koine Greek of that era to be the so-called gotcha verses against homosexuality.
Right. And, I think we're going to do a lot of that discussion again.
Mm-hmm.
And
we could review all of them at some point.
That would be great. And I'm hoping that we'll have some Google Hangout times where people can ask you questions and all that, and that'll be a little further down the road. But today, I'd like to talk about different Bible translations, not necessarily specific words or the gotcha phrases. We can cover those in future episodes. But just the fact that there's so many different translations and so many, and how, well, let me put it this way, like how the Bible was kind of pieced together from different parts. Mm-hmm. And then translated into a bazillion times, and it's kind of like a big game of historical telephone. So,
yeah.
So, what is the deal with the translations, and why do some denominations and people prefer different translations over others?
Well, I think that is actually one of the central questions, honestly, of progressive Christianity going into the third millennium in Christ. I am religious sometimes. Maybe I should apologize to some of your listeners on that one.
Well, you are a reverend, dear.
Well, yeah, there is that. Yeah, they did ordain me. And what I mean by that is, most everybody, even Christian or not, has heard of the King James Version of the Bible.
Right.
For the record, there is not one King James Version of the Bible. There are currently 3 that I can think of off the top of my head that are currently in print. And so, even there, the King James Bible, which still remains the most widely read single book in the human history, has variation. And what that really comes down to is that there's no such thing as a neutral translation. People want to think that you can do a translation that is free of your bias or free of any bias. And I'm here to tell you, folks, that just doesn't happen.
Right.
And perhaps, the behemoth thought leader in this area, at least in terms of the formalist structuralist debate, which gets into a whole philosophical thing, which is perhaps a bit out of scope, at least for today, was Eugene Nida. Mm-hmm. There will, of course, be a bibliographic link to a number of works of his, but there's a particular one that he wrote, which the basic title is On Translation, on the subject of translation. And it was Eugene Nida who, he was 20th century. He was born in the early 20th century, and he actually just died a couple of weeks before we began our core seminary classes in 2011. And he's one of those people who developed a theoretical paradigm that is so, to use one of my favorite phrases, blindingly obvious to a lot of us that we don't even realize that it was actually revolutionary at the time. And the simple name for his theory is dynamic equivalence. And this was specifically in the context of Bible translation.
Right.
And Nida's basic idea is that no two languages are the same.
Right.
Therefore, the very presupposition that you are being faithful to and I'm kind of air quoting this, although your listeners can't see my air quotes.
I see them.
Yeah. The very concept of doing a literal translation is problematic. So, there's this, the oft-told urban legend that, Eskimos, Inuit have 25 words from snow, whereas English doesn't really, because snow is not that preliminarily important in our culture. Okay, well, first of all,
Right.
just to let your listeners know, that's a myth. The Inuit do not have more words for snow than we do. We meaning English speakers. However, culturally speaking, the way that they use those words is different than the way we use them, except maybe, like Swedes and Norwegian people, because much of us do not live in places where, it's frozen half the year.
Right.
So, that's a very real example that a lot of people have in their head, true or not linguistically, that gets at the core of Nida's argument. And this is particularly problematic when you are translating texts that are ancient, that were written by a culture that could not be more removed from yours if it tried.
Right.
And just to throw another monkey wrench into this, we don't have any original text.
Yeah.
People always talk about, reading the original languages of the Bible. Well, that's all fine and good. But yeah, exactly. First of all, we don't have a single original copy of anything. Every single Bible translation in every modern language of humankind is not from an original source.
Right. And they were orally transcribed. And I remember in our New Testament class when Benny Lou did the little experiment with us about how he was orating a text to us and made everybody just transcribe it. And, people made mistakes. People had to cross out words.
And let's even say more importantly with that example, and again, I'll give your listeners a little bit of education on this point. By and large, the texts that we work from, specifically with the, quote, Greek New Testament, for translation into whatever language. I mean, we assume that all Bible translations are in English. That is not true. English happens to have the most number of Bible translations of all human languages, which gets into a whole other topic about linguistic imperialism, which we shall not discuss today. But
that's a whole nother episode.
Oh, yeah. But a lot of the way the Greek specifically was written at the time was all in capital letters without punctuation. So you may hear in some circles people say that, well, in this verse it says this. And, okay, first of all, chapter and verse are modern editions relative to the original text. They're less than 500 years old. So right there, you're already into a problem. Epistemologically, there's your big word for the day.
Right.
But even more importantly, that example from our New Testament class opens up the question of what is a correct translation? Because what our professor did was present basically a pile of letters, all caps with no punctuation. And what's really interesting about that is that some students immediately saw that it was about, let's see if I can remember this. It was about a concert violin competition where Pinchas Zuckerman was one of the judges, I believe, and he was so moved by one competitor's performance that Zuckerman himself put down his violin and offered it to the competitor to play his own violin. Now, if you know anything about violins, that's a big statement right there. But what's really interesting about it is if you divide the words in a slightly different place, you're getting a story about, I think, Soviet Bulgaria. That's still about violins, but it's about Soviet Bulgaria. And so the question is, which is correct? And the answer is both, neither, maybe.
Right. Which, is basically the problem with any translation because, the translator can see it as bird and another person can see it as blue.
Exactly.
And depending on how you translate it, it's going to mean something completely different.
And it gets even worse.
Oh, boy.
Because they didn't have word processors or spell check back then.
Yep.
So one stray letter here or there, it doesn't make that much of a difference, does it? Well, again, a nice little historical thing. In the 4th century of the Common Era, there was a tremendous divide theologically in the Christian church. And it all came down to one letter in one word of one Greek sentence. That it's the homoousia versus the homoiousia. And literally, if you believed in a doctrine based on one spelling of that word minus the iota, and yes, folks, it's not iota, it's iota. Sorry, gotta show my Greek off.
Yes, well, you are the Greek.
Exactly. Essentially, what you are saying is that the Trinity is three beings that are of like substance, but they are three. Whereas if you believe it without the iota, homoousios, you believe that they are the same thing that's of the same substance. And I may have misquoted the history, but what I'm getting at is that that's a pretty profound theological distinction, and it comes down to one letter and one word.
Yeah. And, and I've studied Greek with you before in class, and, it's just amazing. And we have a little bit of that in English, but it's nothing like it is in Greek.
Yeah.
It just takes one letter to make it something different.
And yet Greek, as anybody that's ever got me talking for more than 20 seconds about the Greek language, which is not hard.
Right.
One of the things, and I even have a theological doctrine based on, why, and I get this from a minister named Melissa Scott is actually her name, who does a ministry down in Glendale near Los Angeles. And linguistic exegesis is like her thing. Every sermon she preaches is about that. That Greek is a very precise language, in as much as, for those of you that know Spanish, and for those of you that are blessed or cursed to know both Spanish and German, it is such an ancient language that you can see where German split out from, the mythologized Indo-European parent, mother, grandmother of all languages, and where Spanish and the Latin languages split out, because Greek has these odd features that you could see as like the ancestors of the Germanic languages regarding splitting words apart and recombining them, and prepositions, infixes, suffixes, adfixes. And yet it also has this amazingly layered and nuanced conjugation of verbs, genderized nouns, cases, declensions, etc. Anybody who knows Latin knows what I mean about that. And so in theory, it should be so precise that all of these questions don't come up.
Right.
Such was my theological doctrine when I started studying Greek. Well, folks, it's just not that simple.
Anything, right?
Yeah, because again, one of the things that Eugene Nida has sort of imprinted upon biblical studies is, at its basic root, since no two languages are the same, a literal word-for-word translation actually doesn't serve the reader to understand. And again, I'm going to air quote this phrase, the meaning of the text.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, someone speaking in modern English, or actually for that matter in early modern English, would look at a steam train and would use a certain set of words to describe it. Somebody from, say, the ancient Israelite tribes would see a steam train and would describe it in a very different way, and also in a very different language. And what I'm getting at is that a modern English speaker would describe it in terms of history. It was a historic, steam trains were a historic thing that were really implicated in the settling of the West, or, American history is not my forte, sorry. But to someone from the ancient Israelite context, it would be a clear sign of God or Satan.
Yeah.
Because it could not possibly be. There's no word for steam train in Hebrew, Aramaic, or for that matter, ancient Greek.
Yeah.
Whereas there are words for thing that moves as if by action and belches steam.
Yeah.
So who's to say which is a correct description?
Right. And that brings us in to textual criticism, and, where, how was this put together and where did they come from?
Mm-hmm.
Because, there are a lot of contradictions.
Yes, there are.
And, if you study this, like we've studied it, you can see that there are different sections that you can tell by some of the writing is a very different person.
Yep.
And the way, even when they're translated, I think.
Absolutely.
You can still see different nuances of things that make it like, oh yeah, that's definitely a different person writing this.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that gets me though is that people will say, well, this is the word of God. And while on one level, yeah, I agree. But on another level, it's like, how can you say it's the word of God if there's so many of these contradictions and differences and all that?
Well, this is the interesting thing where language gets political. And there's no avoiding the, 900-pound monkey that's screeching in the middle of the room as we record this.
Mm-hmm.
That if you posit that there's no such thing as a value-free translation, then you're left with the question, which values?
Right.
And now while that might not be apparent as an answer to your question, it very much is. Because, for example, there are many Christians in the world.
Right.
We tend to call them conservative. We tend to call them fundamentalists who believe that the Bible is inerrant. In other words, there are no mistakes in the Bible. There are no mistranslations in the Bible.
Right.
And in that belief system, this whole question gets sidestepped, and actually in a very rational way, that it doesn't matter. That the translation into any language, as long as it reflects our beliefs, meaning that group of people, is by definition correct, because God doesn't make mistakes. Well, that's all fine and good, except sitting from the progressive camp, we tend to see ourselves as somewhat more educated and superior to the fundamentalist camp because, quote, more air quotes, we know that this is a translation. We know that we don't have the original text. We know that scribes occasionally wrote words wrong, forgot things. In the Septuagint, which we may talk about today, or we may do it in a future episode, which for those that don't know, is a translation into Koine, the common tongue Greek of the Hellenistic era, roughly 300 years before Christ to 300 years after Christ, from Hebrew. And the reason that it's called the Septuagint is that, the myth is that there were 70 translators that were scribing in a room, and that the sum total of their efforts became this document called the Old Testament in Hellenistic Greek. Right. Well, that's a myth. First of all, there's no such thing as the Septuagint. There is a collection of things. We actually don't think there may have been 70. There were either like 65 or 78. Right. And more importantly, the Hebrew that they were translating from is not the Hebrew that the modern Jewish faith uses. Right. And just to make it even more fun, we kind of have some textual evidence that in some of these variant Greek manuscripts that every once in a while a scribe might have just kind of forgotten to write a line. Oops. So, imagine reading Shakespeare. Imagine reading one of the great speeches, alas is the winter sun made summer by the son of York. Again, I'm not a Shakespeare expert, but manage if you just kind of dropped out the reference to York. Whoops. Or imagine if Romeo and Juliet, kind of dropped out Juliet stabbing herself. Spoiler alert. It might emerge as a different story. And more importantly, you might make theological conclusions and might conclude that Juliet was gonna stab herself, but she didn't. Right. But we can say, well, we know that she stabbed herself because we have an original Shakespearean text. Okay, do we? Did William Shakespeare ever live? Is William Shakespeare really a real person? Right. Or are his works a collection of different authors representing the same viewpoint? Right. Which gets us exactly to the core of your question, that you either, when you translate, have to look from one language to another. Let's use that example, say from Greek to English. You either have to look backwards to your source text to, quote, be faithful to it, whatever that means, more air quotes, or look forward to your target and say, I am going to, quote, translate it this way, close quote, for the service of my intended audience. Okay. Well, that sounds great and noble. Well, but how are you going? But it brings in some problems. To use the example of the, quote, Hebrew Bible Old Testament, how are you going to tell the story from the books of Joshua and Judges about the civil war between the tribes that is set off by the delivery of the 12 pieces of the concubine's chopped up dead body to the leaders of each tribe to, let's say, a kindergartner? Yeah. You are going to pave over the violence and the egregious body chopping and all that. And so the question that I offer to your listeners is a translation of that particular part of the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, faithful to the original text? Or has the translator, in some goal of communicating the word of God, problematic term, but let's just use it, changed the meaning of the text or altered the meaning of the text or made the image of the chopped body fuzzy so the 9-year-old doesn't have nightmares. And if we're doing that, why are we doing it? And perhaps to give an example from the video of the video episodes of The Greek Geek on the video This Week in Heresy, V1.0, there are, depending on how you want to interpret it, 7 or 8 specific references in the, quote, New Testament. I'm just doing a lot of quotes today. Sorry to the listeners.
That's all right.
Where the text pretty clearly seems to be about homosexuality. Well, first of all, linguistically, I would argue that point, as I did in the video. And so again, your listeners are invited to...
Well, you've got the linguistic argument.
Right. But even more importantly, if we posit from Eugene Nida's idea that dynamic equivalence is what matters, then it's entirely possible that my argument that those verses weren't really about homosexuality,
right,
actually, philologically, another big word for the day, linguistically speaking, is not correct. That in fact, those words are about homosexuality as the Apostle Paul knew it.
Right.
And that brings us to a very big point about the fact that not only is translation political, but it is also, for lack of a better term, sociocultural. Another big word for the day.
Absolutely.
So let me use that example. I will freely admit that I have bias when I translate.
Uh-huh.
I will also add that, as an adherent to the metafaith concept, as you discussed with your wife in episode 1 of this series, that I don't believe that it is my duty, responsibility, or for that matter, my privilege to impose my bias on anybody else. So, for example, my bias in translation is not, to use that favored term of the religious right, to promote the gay agenda. I self-describe as a person whose bias in translation is radical inclusion.
Okay.
So, for example, to go back to the books of Joshua and Judges, which, for those of your listeners that don't know, are perhaps the 2 books of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible that even a lot of conservatives are afraid to really get into, because there's some really disturbing stuff in there.
I remember reading that.
A God-sponsored genocide. Lots of, an old instructor of mine used to introduce those books with, let's talk about death and dismemberment, students.
Yeah, it might even these days, if it was a movie, it'd probably be NC-17.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Well, and the very fact that none other than Adolf Hitler used the book of Joshua to justify genocide against Jews, the people who wrote the book, right, is kind of an interesting point about just how much you can twist theology or interpretation. And again, that's another example. Homosexuality as we know it today, same-sex marriage, committed gay relationships, the concept that there is an identity known as gay, queer, bi, lesbian, whatever,
right, is
kind of an invention of the modern era. Which isn't to say that there weren't men knocking boots with men in ancient Israel, because, folks, there were.
In every culture.
Yeah, I'm sure there were women knocking boots with women. But as I mentioned in the video series, the homosexuality that a writer such as the Apostle Paul would have largely been aware of would have been focused on the anal rape of a conquered male by the conquering male. And pretty much nothing else. Now, am I saying that there weren't other things going on? No, actually, I'm saying the opposite of that. But specifically, what the Apostle Paul is addressing in Romans 1, to use one of those examples, is the homosexuality that he saw in orgies in Corinth. Now, the metafaith lens does require me to kind of take a step back and say, if there are faith groups that do that today, that have cultic orgies, it's not really my place to disinclude them from salvation or from religion, let's say.
Yeah.
But I still have to examine the moral imperative to be a faithful translator to the fact that actually the Apostle Paul was talking about, quote, pagan orgy temple practices.
Right. But one of the big things about contextual criticism and all this is context.
Exactly.
And I think a lot of people, and this isn't just, the fundamentalist Christian thing. This is also from any other group looking in at Christianity
Exactly.
is that, people tend not to see the Bible in context. They get it in the sound bites. And, mostly from the right-wing conservative media, because that's who's got the money and the voice right now,
Right.
which I'm trying to work on with this podcast. But, that's what they hear. That's what they understand. But yet a lot of people will never read the Bible on their own.
Right.
Or they will take it completely out of cultural context.
Absolutely. And, I'm going to sit with the example of Romans 1, where the Apostle Paul writes of, these orgiastic things that he's witnessing. And he actually frames it in a very rather strongly worded statement that essentially God was so enraged by, and, you can get into an interesting argument here. Was God enraged by the behavior or by the fact that it was being done as part of worshiping of another deity besides, quote, the God of the Jews, Yahweh, right, the one? I would argue that it's actually the latter, not the former. Mm-hmm. But even more importantly, if I am going to translate that pericope, that was jargon for my profession. If I'm going to translate that set of verses right into an English that, say, a listener of this podcast who is not churched, in other words, is not a religious person, but just wants to read it as literature or to understand what it is that these Christians call the Bible, mm-hmm, what am I going to do with that? Because my bias in translation always tends to lead toward radical inclusion, which is a very deeply formed theology that, as I understand, is going to be discussed in great detail in future episodes.
Absolutely.
And the moral compunction that guides me, and I'll say as a translator, an interpreter, a preacher, an author, a musician, and as a Christian, as a faithful believer in Jesus Christ as my Messiah, is to privilege inclusion over exclusion. Mm-hmm. So somebody like me translating this particular set of verses runs into a real problem because the Apostle Paul was speaking of God being so enraged that God cursed this group of people with same-sex lust. Okay, how do I say that in a way that makes it clear that the Apostle Paul is not talking about like modern gay people, like Oscar Wilde forward to Harvey Milk and beyond.
Right.
What he's talking about is that this is a group of people whose religious beliefs were so offensive to this Yahweh, God of the Jews, that he cursed them. And,
right,
full disclosure here, I did say God is a man here, but I don't mean it. Sorry, that's the politically correct translator in me.
Well, and the little side note, in the metafaith side, you are free to envision God as you will.
Exactly.
So
right. And ironically, I do think of God as an intergender deity or intersex deity or a multiply gender deity, but yet English fails us because it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
I wouldn't call a trans person it, so I'm not going to call God it.
Right.
Anyway, so back to the point at hand. Yes, folks, I do more than just translate. So I am faced with a dilemma because my choices are to footnote it. That's why we have annotated translations. And I encourage anybody that ever wants to quote really, why do I keep quoting? Somebody who really wants to get into the meat of this to find an annotated translation of the Bible, such as the Revised Standard or the New Revised Standard Version. And just to point out the truth of what I was saying earlier, there's the New Revised Standard Version, and then there's the New Revised Standard Version Catholic Edition, the New Revised Standard Version Anglicized Catholic Edition, and the New Revised Standard Version Anglicized Non-Catholic Version.
Mm-hmm. And then there's the ones that have everything but the kitchen sink.
Well, yeah, that's the Catholic Edition. And
yes.
As far as I know, there's not an Ethiopian Orthodox translation of it.
Yeah.
Which, that's Old Testament class. We'll talk about that some other time.
Right.
Anyway, I can footnote it and say, it is important for the reader to understand that the Apostle Paul is referring in here to the practice of homosexuality within the cultic practices, blah, 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 which is great, thorough, ethically responsible as a translator, and would be in print so small that 90% of the readers would yawn and move on.
Right.
Another option is for me to come up with a set of words to insert into that spot in translation that preserves here's a value judgment here. The epic flow of the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans, which in many ways is one of the most awesome writings of the Apostle Paul. How do I preserve the sense of his voice while actually introducing this modern important distinction? Right. Now, as a person who privileges inclusion over exclusion in my work in general, this is a real problem. Because just as soon as let's hypothesize that I came up with some magical way to come up with some non-clunky wording for this. Right. I'm still left with a fundamental problem that the temples specifically that the Apostle Paul was railing against were the temples of Artemis Diana. Now, all jokes about the Dianic pagans aside, see, I'm a Christian who prays well with pagans.
Yeah, we won't go there.
Yeah, I love you, Z Budapest. All jokes aside, there is a modern religious descendant of that particular temple cult in Corinth of the time. How do I remain faithful to my Christianity as a translator who is Christianly translating a document of Christian religion without doing harm to non-Christians? Right. And it's really easy for us on the progressive historical textual criticism side to say, well, the Apostle Paul was a Jew. They were Messianic Jews, but because there weren't any Christians at the time. That's fine for the other Abrahamic faiths. But what do you do about the pagans? Right. Well, I mean, here's a thought or a question thought thing. How do you, so say you have a translation and, you're taking into account all these issues, but it's still not, it's still not going to be perfect. You're still going to have problems with translation. How would you teach it to somebody, say a pagan or a Buddhist or a Muslim or somebody else outside of the Christian bubble? How would you teach it to them to let them know this is how it was translated here? This is how I translated it, but this is what is going on in this text. And that's such a beautifully, concretely stated question on your part, Reverend Pont. Why, thank you. That is 900-pound gorilla, monkeys jumping on typewriters to type Shakespeare, Reverend Lee Whitaker's cat napping on top of my lav mic cord, one of your cats about to jump into my lap. Oh, and by the way, there's an earthquake and it's raining in the middle of July in Northern California kind of questions. And what I mean by that is, at best, what you do is you inform your reader that you understand that you have been placed in a place of teaching them. And, this goes back to something in your, I believe, episode 2 with Jay talking about the idea of, why does the person of the marginalized group always be assumed that you have to teach the white person about racism? Right. This for me, as my personal moral answer to this, starts with me saying, okay, I'm going to be a teacher, which means that I have a social compact with, and let's use the example, with the Christian-fearing modern neo-pagan audience, that I am their teacher. They are agreeing to let me be their teacher, and I am committing to do it. Right there, I have an ethical responsibility to present the faith as truthfully as I can. But even therein, we have a problem, because as much as there's no such thing as a value-free translation, again, folks, read Eugene Nida, great author about this. The original text, which we don't actually have to review my earlier point, but the hypothesized original text, let's say, was not free of values. Right. The translation is not free of values. Right. The way that I present the translation, whether I'm translating it myself or using somebody else's, is not free of values. And, let's also add, I had a really bad commute to that on that day to teach the person. So I'm really kind of pissed off when I get there. And so I'm probably more likely to be negative anyway. And perhaps this is a bit of an insane set of examples. But the truth of this remains that at best, I am presenting either a like 35,000 foot view of multiple strains of Christianity or multiple interpretations of this verse, this book, whatever, or the precise opposite. I am camping out and living in one specific house under the Christian neighborhood. And in order to do that, it is ethically, in my personal moral theology, it is ethically required for me to admit that bias.
Right.
I will never be able to truthfully interpret the biblical corpus without stating that my bias is pro-inclusion. In other words, my questions of the reader or of the Christian faith is, how can we interpret this text so that we bring the most people in, as opposed to keep the most people out?
Right.
My next bias is Jesus. And I will use an example here. One could actually brand me a fundamentalist. Now, before you start running for the hills, and I mean that to the listeners, card-carrying Marxist socialist here, folks. I believe in gay marriage and I have Christian theology to prove it. I mean, to prove that my belief is Christian. But I am a fundamentalist in one very specific sense. I personally believe in the literal death of likely an Aramaic-speaking poor man named Jesus ben Yosef or Bar Yosef on a Roman cross, and that the Christian communion rite actually do some mystically way that I can't explain, turn these elements, the host, meaning the bread, and the wine, the grape juice, the Fanta, the Mr. Pibb, it doesn't matter what it starts as.
Right.
But it mystically becomes the body and blood of Jesus Christ, which means that we are, in a sense, a cannibal religion. And we got nothing on the Aztecs. But anyway. And what I mean by saying I'm a fundamentalist is that I believe that to be literally true. I believe that happened, quote, as recorded in the Bible. And that when we do communion, that's what we are doing. And yet, any translation that I make will have that bias. However, you were at your wedding, so you know exactly what I'm going to talk about. I was presiding over communion at your wedding.
Right.
And there was a large number of pagans that are not affiliated with other religions. There is one Israeli Jew, by the way, with whom I sang the Shema Yisrael at the beginning in a duet. I just want to point that out.
Yes, it was very lovely.
I rock. What can I say?
Hey.
And when it was communion time, my liturgy was very traditional Anglo-Catholic. But I also pointed out to everybody that you are invited to experience this. And if it's just, what was it? It was Kool-Aid grape non-sugar water enhancer flavored in a chalice and gluten-free crackers.
Yeah.
And what I said to people, which really got through to the Jew and to the pagans, I might say, in the room, is that if all this is some funky Christianized ritual that, all it is grape taste and water with a gluten-free cracker, then that's fine. I don't need you to think that you are mystically a cannibal. It doesn't really matter to me one bit. You are still invited to my table. Now, would I go that far in translating the Bible? Probably not. But that's because I would want to be truthful to the culture that wrote the text.
Right.
And so it remains an unresolved question. But at the end of the day, what matters is that if I'm going to be accused of bias, I would rather be accused of bias that lets too many people in than bias that doesn't let enough in.
I think that's great. And, I think that's one of the ways to really teach people, and I try to do that too. Is like, listen, this is where I'm coming from this, and you don't have to believe like I do. And, it just, I think it helps, like I mentioned before, it helps to meet people where they're at. And I think that's really important.
Well, and let's perhaps close or get toward closing with a tiny vignette actually from our seminary experience. We, in our cohort going through seminary, had a track of classes with somebody who was in, I believe the way that she identifies is an earth-based spirituality practitioner. And we were in Christian worship class together because it's a required class that you got to take for MDiv.
Yeah.
And, she sat out the communion ritual. She did not want to participate in the circle. And, that is her choice. Yeah, it made me sad, but because everybody is welcome at my table. But more importantly, she pulled me aside and said, that it wasn't until seeing my body language while we were doing the communion that she understood why Christians who are all Jesus focused really are. And that she, as a non-Christian, walked out of that experience with a better understanding of why Jesus is so important in the world of the Christians. And that some of us love Jesus just as much as the right wing and aren't against her.
Yeah.
And that remains my biggest dream for the Christianity that I practice, that you practice, and that your church represents.
Right. Yeah. I can't say it better than that. So we are out of time, unfortunately. But I know you're going to be back because you were requested by a fan. So where can people reach you if they would like to have more conversation with you? Well,
even though there's a billion people on Facebook, my name is unique on Facebook. My first name is Philip with one L, and my last name is Tanner, Tanner. These are two very non-unique names. However, my middle name on Facebook is Evangelistus, which evangelist, I will preach, and I spell it with the ancient EU. So find Philip Evangelistus Tanner, which we can link, I suppose. Yeah. Also, my blog, philippostulostheu.blogspot. Yes, it's the AOL of blogs, but I like it. It's basic. It's simple. And we'll put that link on there. And it's a transliteration of Philip, a slave of God.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I said, folks. It's an all over the place blog. But I'm on Twitter as GWM Jedi, gay white male Jedi. Yeah, that's what I said, folks. I'm also on Twitter as Koine Spasikla, which is the Greek geek pseudo identity.
Right. And you have a blog to match that.
And it also has a blog. So we'll just put a lot of links on there and people can track it.
Yeah, we'll link this all in the show notes and we'll put in the Eugene Nida books in the book list. Yep. And and let people know where to find you.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Philip.
And thank you to the fans for wanting to hear from me again.
Yeah, it was kind of exciting when I was starting this back up again.
Oh, little old me.
Like I had a fan. Philip had a fan. Cool.
Amen to that.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And we'll have you back again.
You are most welcome. Go in peace.
That's it for this week's edition of This Week in Heresy. I'd like to thank Philip for being our in-studio guest. And if you have comments or questions about this episode or want to listen to other episodes or see the show notes, go to thisweekinheresy.com. And you can always subscribe to us via iTunes and the Stitcher app. Thanks so very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.